All right, let's dive into this stack of reports, analysis, and notes we've got here. We're looking at uh, a really pivotal moment in the Ukraine conflict.
Yes, specifically Ukraine's big drone strikes deep inside Russia, and then how Russia responded, hitting back hard across Ukraine.
Exactly. And our goal today isn't just to recap the news. We want to pull out the real lessons, right?
That's the plan. We're digging into the tactics Ukraine used, the actual impact on Russia, the nature of their retaliation, and maybe most importantly, what military thinkers are saying this means for the future of war. Especially, for forces like the U.S. military.
Think of this as your shortcut to understanding how conflict is changing fast, straight from the source material you provided. It's pretty eye-opening.
It really is. What jumps out immediately from these sources is how a relatively low-cost approach was used to get a big effect against some very high-value targets.
It definitely does. So let's start with the event itself. The sources are calling it Operation Spider's Web. This was June 1st, 2025. What exactly happened?
Okay, so this was described as a sophisticated, pretty widespread drone attack by Ukraine's SBU, their security service. And the method, according to these reports, was really innovative.
How so?
Well, instead of launching from way back in Ukraine, they reportedly used these semi-trailers designed with false tops. These trucks apparently carried 117 attack drones close to several Russian bomber bases.
Wait, so they basically drove the drones most of the way there, hidden inside trucks?
Pretty much, yeah, and then launched them from nearby. This tactic, it seems, let them bypass defenses closer to the border and hit targets way deep inside Russia.
Deep inside is right. The sources mentioned this happened across the breadth of Russia.
That's right. Not just near the border. We're talking targets like Belaya Air Base in the Irkutsk region.
Belaya. That's got to be, what, over 2,600 miles from Ukraine? That's an incredible reach for this kind of strike.
Absolutely astounding.
So why these specific bomber bases? What was the goal?
According to the SBU itself, these bases are home to the 295 Bear and the 222 Backfire strategic bombers. These are the planes Russia uses to launch cruise missiles into Ukraine, often firing them from well inside Russian airspace, safely.
Ah, okay. So the idea was to hit the launchers themselves.
Exactly. Neutralize that threat at its source, as the SBU put it. Take the fight directly to the planes launching the missiles.
Makes sense. What were the specific targets besides those bombers, and what did Ukraine claim initially?
Well, the targets included those crucial 295s and 222s, but also an A-50 Mainstay aircraft that's basically a big flying radar and command post, and some cargo planes, too.
And the initial claims?
Ukraine's first public claim was pretty bold. More than 40 aircraft destroyed. That number, though, was later walked back a bit to at least 13.
At least 13 still sounds like a major hit. Was there any confirmation on that?
Yes, the sources do point to satellite imagery and even drone footage that came out later. This confirmed heavy damage, especially to the 295 and 222 bombers at bases like Belaya and Alenia. And the SBU chief, Vasyl Malyuk, he made an even bigger claim, saying, in total, 34% of strategic cruise missile carriers at the main Russian airfields were destroyed.
34%. Wow. That's a huge number if it's accurate. Hard to verify, I imagine.
Very hard to verify independently,
yeah.
But the general consensus from the material we looked at is that, yes, substantial damage was definitely inflicted.
Okay, 34% or not, hitting those strategic assets is significant. What about the drones themselves? What do the sources say about the tech?
They're described mostly as cheap, easy to produce, and tactically effective precision munitions. This whole operation is being held up as a key example of how innovation in combat is growing so much more rapid. That's a quote from Air Force Chief of Staff General David Alvin in one of the sources.
Rapid innovation, using cheaper tech.
Right. And some reports even suggest these drones had automated capabilities, maybe using AI for navigation, which would be really important if they face jamming, to stay on target.
So pairing relatively inexpensive tech, maybe even AI-guided, with really clever delivery tactics to hit these, multi-million-dollar strategic bombers. What's the big strategic takeaway here, according to the experts?
Well, retired Lieutenant General David Depchula, analyzing this, called it a compelling example of applying an effects-based approach to operations.
Effects-based, meaning?
Meaning Ukraine, lacking its own expensive long-range strike planes, used this different, innovative method to achieve a very specific strategic effect. In this case, neutralizing Russia's air power right where it lives. It wasn't just random damage, it was targeted disruption.
And in doing that, it really put a spotlight on a major vulnerability.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It showed just how vulnerable these high-value aircraft are when they're just parked out in the open on these huge airfields. The sources even mentioned Russia tried some pretty basic defenses.
Like what?
Like putting old car tires on the wings and fuselage of the bombers, or painting fake aircraft silhouettes on the tarmac, trying to confuse targeting systems, basically.
Tires on bombers. Seriously, that sounds kind of desperate.
It does sound a bit makeshift, doesn't it? But it really highlights the problem. How do you defend these vast open bases against lots of small incoming drones? Those improvised measures that clearly weren't enough.
Yeah, clearly not. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. What about the impact on Russia's actual bomber force? How bad is the damage to these specific types of planes?
It's pretty significant because, as the sources point out, planes like the 295 and 222, they're effectively irreplaceable. Russia isn't building new ones.
So any plane destroyed or badly damaged is just gone, a permanent loss.
Essentially, yes, it's a permanent reduction in the strength of those particular fleets. And it's not just about the cost to replace them, it's the capability itself.
Right.
Experts note the huge expense Russia faces just for repairs, let alone trying to beef up defenses. And while these older planes are basically priceless for their current role, the only strategic bomber Russia is still building in very limited numbers, the Tu-160, costs something like over $500 million each. They just can't easily replace big losses of these older workhorses.
So, operationally, what does this mean for Russia's ability to keep launching missile strikes against Ukraine? Does it stop them?
It's not clear from the sources if it stops them completely. Russia still has other ways to strike, but it absolutely represents a significant and permanent reduction in a key part of their aging bomber force. A chunk of that specific capability is gone for good.
And there's another layer here too, right? The nuclear aspect.
Yes, that's important. These strategic bombers, they're part of Russia's nuclear triad, the air-launched part, along with their land-based missiles and subs. Hitting these assets, which Moscow has called a red line before, well, it impacts the perceived credibility and flexibility of their whole nuclear deterrent.
So, given how successful this attack was, what might Russia do now to protect the bombers they still have?
The analysis suggests they'll likely try to disperse the remaining planes more, spread them out across more airfields to make them less concentrated targets.
Makes sense. Harder to hit them all at once.
Exactly. And maybe accelerate efforts to build hardened aircraft shelters.
Mm-hmm.
But, building shelters big enough for these massive bombers, that's a huge engineering challenge and really expensive.
Right, a major undertaking. Okay, so that was Ukraine's strike. How did Russia actually respond to being hit like that, so deep inside their own territory?
Well, it didn't take long. Just days later, on the night of June 5th to 6th, Russia launched a really massive wave of attacks across Ukraine.
And did they explicitly say this was payback for the drone raid?
Oh, yeah. The Russian Defense Ministry came out and publicly stated these strikes were a direct response and retaliation for Operation Spider's Web. Their claim was they were targeting Ukraine's defense industry and military infrastructure.
What was the scale of this retaliation? How big was it?
It was huge. The sources detail Russia using a total of 452 aerial attack assets. That's a mix of missiles and drones. And they hit cities all across Ukraine: Kyiv, Ternopil, Lutsk, Chernihiv, places in Lviv Oblast, out west. Widespread.
452 incoming threats. What was the impact on the ground in Ukraine?
The attacks definitely caused casualties and damage. Sources reported people killed and injured in several places. In Kyiv alone, 3 rescuers were killed and dozens injured. Infrastructure got hit too, like railway tracks near Kyiv.
But Ukrainian officials, they had a different take on what Russia was actually hitting, didn't they?
They pushed back hard, yes. They contested Russia's claim about only hitting military sites. Ukrainian officials stressed that Russia's attacks time and again hit civilians and civilian infrastructure.
So a direct contrast.
Exactly. Ukraine's foreign minister, Sybiha, is quoted drawing that contrast explicitly, saying Ukraine targets military sites while Russia bombs civilians in response. And this aligns with other reports mentioned in the sources from earlier in 2025, noting a worrying trend of rising civilian casualties from bombing and explosive weapons used in populated areas, unfortunately by both sides in the conflict overall.
Amidst that huge barrage, how did Ukraine's air defenses hold up?
Pretty well, actually, according to the reports. They reportedly shot down 406 out of those 452 incoming missiles and drones. That's a high success rate.
That is impressive.
It is. Though analysts always add the caveat. Sustaining that kind of defense requires a constant supply of interceptor missiles, which is always a major challenge for Ukraine.
And strategically, these massive Russian barrages serve another purpose, too.
Analysts suggest so. It's not just about immediate revenge. These large-scale attacks are likely also aimed at grinding down Ukraine's overall resolve, their will to fight, and also depleting their air defense stockpiles over time. Plus, there's always the concern these barrages might be used to test out new Russian weapons or delivery systems.
And all this was happening while there were attempts at peace talks, wasn't it?
That's another key bit of context from the sources, yeah. These major attacks happen right around the time talks were apparently sputtering. Russia reportedly rejected an unconditional ceasefire and was only offering maybe a very short, localized truce. Massive military actions like these obviously have a big impact on the mood and prospects for any negotiation.
Right. Okay, let's pivot now to the lessons learned, particularly for the U.S. military. What are the experts saying this whole episode means for forces like the U.S. Air Force?
This definitely got the attention of U.S. defense analysts, and the sources are quite direct about the implications. First, while they acknowledge Ukraine's innovation was impressive, experts from places like the Mitchell Institute are cautioning that Ukraine's specific tactics here, they aren't necessarily a direct template for how the U.S. Air Force should operate, meaning the U.S. still needs its high-end, long-range strike capabilities, like the advanced B-21 bomber. Mark Gunzinger is quoted specifically saying, "I would caution against interpreting this innovative strike as something more than it was. Essentially, don't assume cheap drones completely replace the need for sophisticated air power."
Okay, so maybe not a blueprint for how the U.S. should attack, but what about defense? Is it a wait-up call there?
That seems to be the loudest and clearest message coming from these experts. Gunzinger is very blunt about it. He says the attack provides abundant evidence that we must invest in defenses against these threats abroad and in our homeland, and do so now, before we experience a similar strategic shock.
Invest in defenses, even in the homeland. That sounds like a pretty stark warning.
It is, and Gunzinger expands on that, saying too many in the U.S. still sort of assume the homeland is a safe zone, a sanctuary from kinetic attack. He argues we need to start operating as if our own bases, overseas and potentially within the U.S., will be targeted by things like long-range missiles, drones, unconventional attacks, just like Russia saw here.
So whose job is it to defend those bases, especially Air Force bases? Is that clear?
Well, that's actually a point of friction highlighted in the sources. These experts argue pretty forcefully that the Air Force itself needs to take more responsibility for defending its own bases and forces.
Not some other branch.
They point out the Army was technically given that mission way back in 1947, but in their view, the Army has basically neglected it for decades, focusing on other things. So these experts are pushing hard for more funding, more personnel, specifically for Air Force space defense. Gunzinger puts it plainly, our Air Force must prepare to defend its own bases and forces.
Interesting. So this leads directly into debates about where the money should go, right? Investment priorities.
Exactly. Retired General Depula weighs in, suggesting things like counter-drone systems and base defenses need to become top priorities. He even suggests maybe redirecting money from other programs to pay for it.
Like what kind of programs?
He specifically mentions potentially redirecting funds from things like the Army's hypersonic missile development. His argument is that those kinds of weapons are maybe too destabilizing in peacetime and use up too much lift to be practical in wartime.
So shift money from very high-tech, long-range offensive weapons towards more immediate practical base defense.
That's the core argument being made, yeah. Rethink where the critical investments need to go based on the threats we're actually seeing demonstrated right now. And it's not just the Air Force. The sources emphasize that all U.S. military branches need to urgently prioritize base and area defense and also look at decentralizing operations spreading out to be less inviting targets.
Makes sense. Less concentration, less risk.
Right. Because force protection, defending your own stuff, hasn't really been a top investment area since the Cold War ended. Mostly because of cost and maybe a perception that the threat wasn't quite there. But the experts are basically shouting, that is no longer the case.
And the danger shown by Ukraine's attack, using those cheap, small, and numerous precision-guided munitions, it's not just about planes sitting on runways, is it?
That's a crucial point Depula makes. He stresses this kind of vulnerability applies right across the board to infantry units in the field, tanks, ships at port, logistics depots, command centers, you name it.
Everything's a potential target for these kinds of attacks.
Pretty much. Any part of military power that can't survive these kinds of numerous, relatively cheap attacks is, in his words, potentially a hollow deterrent. It might look impressive, but if it's easily taken out, it's fundamentally vulnerable. This demands new ways of thinking about defense across the entire military.
So wrapping this up, what does this all really mean for you, the listener, trying to make sense of this?
Well, this deep dive into the sources, it really shows a key moment where, relatively cheap, innovative tech landed a serious punch against very expensive, hard-to-replace strategic assets. It threw a harsh spotlight on vulnerabilities, especially base defense against drone swarms, and similar threats that military experts are now saying very loudly need urgent attention.
We've seen the tactical ingenuity of Ukraine's operation, the strategic goal they were aiming for, and then the brutal retaliatory cycle it seemed to kick off across Ukraine. For you, this story is just a powerful reminder of how fast the tools and tactics of war are evolving, and how old ideas about safety and security are really being tested.
And here's maybe the most interesting or perhaps unsettling thought to leave you with. This whole event, the strikes deep in Russia, the analysis it prompted from U.S. experts, it really hammers home this idea that sanctuary, the feeling of being safe from attack, whether you're an airbase thousands of miles away or maybe even territory previously thought untouchable, that idea is sort of going away as a concept. That's General Alvin's phrase again.
If nowhere is truly a sanctuary anymore, how does that fundamentally change how we need to think about defense, about security, about our own vulnerability? That's a big question, and definitely something worth mulling over based on what we've unpacked today.